If you're like me or most of our listeners, you're obsessed with finding an edge for your streaming strategy. One of my favorite ways to find that edge for state of streaming is through the tools and data from our friends at Looper Insights. So I asked them to put together a suite of the best stuff just for you. You can get it. Visit mystreamingvalue.com to compare the value of CTV home screens, which space is worth the most, what makes Roku so valuable that Fox is willing to pay $22 billion for it. Find out at mystreamingvalue.com. And thank you to our friends at Looper Insights for making all of these resources available. Now, time for the episode. Did you know that the average American uses 11 different streaming services over the course of a year, or that 40% of adults feel completely overwhelmed by all of the choices that they have? Welcome to the State of Streaming podcast. Today, we are joined by Emily Williams from MRI-Simmons to discuss why the future of media planning relies on the consumer truth. We explore moving beyond basic impressions to truly understand the diverse behaviors and purchasing habits of the audience behind the screen. And if you want to stay ahead in the streaming landscape, make sure to subscribe wherever you're listening so you never miss an episode. Now, let's dive into the conversation. Emily Williams, welcome to the Stay Streaming podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Can you tell us, maybe in a word or two, who is MRI-Simmons? What problem do you solve? Who do you solve that for?
I'll probably use more than one or two words, but MRI-Simmons is one of the leading consumer insights companies in the US. So we are helping brands, agencies, and media companies understand the American consumer through what is a nationally representative single source view of their behaviors, their attitudes, media consumption, and purchasing habits. And what really sets us apart is our commitment to what we call the consumer truth. We're the consumer truth set. Our data is built on what's called address-based probabilistic sampling, which is, kind of the gold standard in research. But what that means is that we actually ensure that the people that we're measuring are real people, real households in the US. These are not convenience panels of people who have opted in to do this. Like, we're reaching directly to people in our households and making sure that that set accurately represents all the diversity and striations of the US population. And so we help marketers and media companies, move beyond the impressions and exposures to really understand who the person is as a whole, who they're reaching, what they care about, what they buy, and how all of those behaviors connect in, today's fragmented media landscape.
And ultimately driving to that purchase, that's our goal as advertisers, is to get a new customer, to get one of our best customers to come back and spend more money with us. But consumers don't think in terms of linear or streaming or social or digital. It's just all content. So why do you think, do you have a idea as to why the advertising industry kind of still plans and measures media the way that we do?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I think it's part of its history. For a long time, media channels were pretty distinct. You had your TV team, your radio team, your print team, and consumers spent a lot of time in a relatively small number of places, and planning around channels made a lot of sense. But consumer behavior has really evolved much faster than the systems that we use to plan and measure it. So what we see is that today, people follow content and communities, not necessarily platforms. You remember, like, when Netflix started their streaming business and moved away from renting DVDs, everybody was on Netflix. Everybody was saying, I'm going to go watch Netflix and chill.
Totally.
They just went.
It was the only option.
It was the only option. And it was a huge thing as streaming was becoming a thing, streaming video. But today, that's not necessarily the case. People are going for content. They have a show they want to watch. They have a game they want to watch. They'll go wherever they need to go to watch it. So we're not focused so much on the platform. We're seeking that content. Even looking at sports as an example, thinking about NFL fans. I recently wrote and published a blog on our website about the different activation windows of NFL fans with football season coming up. So this is top of mind for me. On game day, NFL fans are not like, today I'm going to consume linear TV or today I'm going to consume streaming. They're saying I want to watch the game. So whether that game happens to be on broadcast or YouTube TV or Peacock or, through highlights on social media, they're simply following the content wherever it goes. That's where MRI-Simmons has always had sort of a unique perspective because we've never looked at consumers through a lens of a single channel. We look at the whole person. And so when you look at consumers that way, you start to realize that these channels are simply touch points along a much bigger journey.
Sure. And thinking about something that is discussed more industry wide, but we've definitely touched on here on the podcast is the fragmentation of discovery. Have you uncovered any insights about how fragmentation and the challenge of discovery kind of plays into that?
I mean, one insight, I think advertisers consistently underestimate how difficult true incremental reach has become, right? There's this tendency to think of streaming as this giant pool of cord cutters. And the assumption is if I add streaming to my media plan, I'm automatically adding a net new audience. But we know that's probably not true. At MRI-Simmons, we have this cord evolution study. It's one of our syndicated focus studies, which is a topical study that we dive even deeper into a topic. We deliver it 3 times a year, and its focus is on how Americans engage with video content. And data in that study reveals that 75% of Americans who have traditional cable and satellite TV also stream. So they're stackers. So if marketers have a streaming plan and a linear plan, chances are you're showing up in front of the same people. And what's more is I think you'll like this stats. The average number of streaming services that Americans use in a typical year is 11.
Wow.
So, yeah, and this is across.
So that's one every month. That's a new service that is the churn conversation articulated.
And that's average. So sure, you'll have some people who are, loyal to 3 or 4, but then you have people using many more than 11. And this is across ad-supported subscription services and fast channels, and others. But we know consumers are moving fluidly across numerous platforms throughout the course of the week, often multiple times a day. So what could look like incremental reach is really you're reaching the same audience repeatedly in different environments. So, just because a campaign is running across 5 different platforms doesn't mean you're reaching 5 different groups of people. There's likely significant overlap. And once you factor in things like shared devices in the household, multiple devices per person, it becomes even harder to know how much truly incremental reach you're generating. And so that's why audience understanding has become so important, because before asking how many platforms should I buy, marketers should be asking who am I trying to reach and where are they already being reached? Because the goal isn't simply to add more impressions. It's, to find the consumers you haven't reached yet. So let's say I'm targeting a specific segment for my campaign. If they're already heavy users of streaming and social video and YouTube, adding another streaming platform might not create nearly as much reach as I expect. But on the other hand, if I understand where gaps exist in their media consumption or where they're less likely to be, I can make smarter decisions about where to invest next. And that's really where consumer insights come into play.
That's a massive nugget just right there, Emily. I'm curious if maybe the inverse, is there a metric that you think we can throw out or that we should be disregarding?
Oh man, there could be a few things. You're asking me. A metric that I'd eliminate, or maybe let's say a metric that maybe I've stopped using in isolation. Let's say it like that. A metric stop using in isolation is total minutes viewed.
Ooh,
so
why?
Not because it's useless, it absolutely has value, but because we've allowed it to become a proxy for success. When by itself, it doesn't really tell us very much. For creator content, a lot of creators have to hit a certain threshold of minutes viewed to unlock monetization, and large streaming services use total hours viewed as their primary KPI. And hearing something that received 10 billion minutes viewed. That's amazing. But my first question is always, so what? Did the content reach the right people? Did it introduce a new brand? Did it change behaviors? Were viewers actually paying attention and engaging with the content? Like I can't even tell you how many times I have something playing on the TV while I'm cooking dinner. So,
It's just
in
background
fact,
noise.
it's just background noise, minutes view doesn't equal engagement and attention. In fact, our USA study data, which is our core MRI-Simmons product, is our USA study. We reveal that over 60%, I think it's like 63% of adults say that when they're watching TV, they're usually doing other activities. So that tells me like attention is
I'm in that
likely not as
63% for sure.
that's what I'm saying. Me too. Like cooking, crafting, doing stuff, cleaning, it tells us that like, and people are aware of this too. People have reported this. So at least that there's an awareness of this, and this tells us that attention is likely not as high as we like to think it is. So minutes viewed can answer a lot of questions, what platforms they're on, how long they're on, but it can't answer everything by itself. Let's say a campaign generates 100 million minutes viewed among people who have no interest in my category. Another generate only 20 million minutes among high value prospects. Which campaign is better? So, if we're only looking at viewing minutes, we choose the first one every time, but we know that's the wrong answer. And this is where audience understanding becomes so important because, exposure and minutes viewed and attention are all valuable, but none of those metrics tell you whether you're connecting with the people who matter most to your business. And that's why we spend so much time helping marketers understand the person behind the impression. So if I could wave a magic wand and, I'd add to every one of those headlines that talks about total view time and total hours viewed, I would add, who were the people we actually reached and why did they matter to my business? Because once you know that, the number becomes a lot more meaningful.
Can first party data, is there a role for first party data to help solve some of this?
Yeah. I mean, first party data is incredibly valuable. If I were a streaming platform, I absolutely want to leverage every signal I have available, of course. The reality is that these companies, these streaming platforms, they can see an enormous amount of what happens inside their ecosystems. They know what people are watching, when, how often, if they completed a show, if they stopped halfway through. And those are all incredibly powerful signals. But every platform has the same challenge. They only see that piece of the consumer's life. For example, a platform might know that I watched a music documentary, that I streamed 3 video podcasts this week, and that I spend a lot of time watching game show content during my lunch breaks. That's useful. But it can't tell you that I'm planning a trip to Italy this summer, which is true, that I'm preparing home renovations, that I've recently purchased my first electric vehicle. Those are the kinds of attributes that advertisers.
Congrats.
Thank you. Those are the kinds of attributes that advertisers really want to know. And that's, I think, where MRI-Simmons, my company, comes in and fits into this like first party data world. Our role is to provide the consumer context around those media behaviors. So we help marketers understand not just what people are doing, but who they are and what they buy and how all of those behaviors connect across channels. So rather than thinking of like first party data versus consumer insights, I think the future is really about combining the two. We launched a product a couple years ago called Consumer Canvas. And Consumer Canvas is a data enrichment solution that helps marketers bring our consumer intelligence into their own first party data. It's built on our core USA study, and it uses an identity framework that brings like over 60,000 of those more fun attributes, those Italy, EV, all those fun things to a population scale of over 250 million adults. So maybe a platform's customer file might tell you that they subscribed to their streaming service or they watched a certain program. data enrichment can help you understand, well, they are luxury travelers, they are sports enthusiasts, they are heavy restaurant goers, or any number of dimensions that actually impact real purchasing decisions. And what I love about this approach is that it's not about replacing first party data. That has a huge role, but it's about making first party data smarter. And I think that's the future, because when you combine those two things, that's when audience understanding gets really powerful.
We've got all this data. We know it's super valuable, but actually doing something with it, that sounds like the application that you're driving to. And we hear a lot about this idea of a unified audience, which I think from an advertising perspective, we would just love to see, hey, who saw our ads and bought a thing? Does the unified audience, does it mean more than that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think I hear people use the phrase like unified audience view, and they talk about it like it's a technology problem, but in practice, it's a consumer problem. Consumers, they don't wake up and think, "Oh, today I'm a streaming viewer, or I'm a podcast listener, or I'm a, social media user," which is how we tend to define them in the industry. Consumers are just moving about their day, you know? So they might, watch a show on Hulu in the morning, listen to a podcast on their commute. They're scrolling Instagram at lunch. They're watching a game on ESPN, and then they buy something on Amazon before they go to bed. From their perspective, that's a normal person having a normal day. But from the industry's perspective, those are often like 5 different data sets. So to me, a truly unified audience view means being able to connect all of those touch points back to a real human being and understand them consistently, no matter where they're engaging. So instead of saying, here's my social media audience and here's my podcast audience, you're able to say, this is a group of consumers who are likely auto buyers, or these are affluent travelers planning a vacation in the next year. Suddenly the audience becomes the organizing principle instead of the channel that you're on. And that's actually one of the reasons MRI-Simmons has been so valuable to marketers for decades. Our data has always been built around people, not platforms. And our research in our USA study can actually tell you that, nearly 90% of Instagram users shop on Amazon, or half of Amazon shoppers watch Hulu. But more than that, we see that nearly half of Instagram users say they're likely to take an international vacation in the next year. And a third of Hulu viewers are in market for a new car. So, those are all real stats that we have access to. So a unified audience view, I think, means having a full understanding of the person and all of their behaviors behind the click.
Fascinating. I'm curious, yeah. Emily, if we look 3 years forward from now, what's something that we will look back on as maybe we got this part wrong?
Oh goodness. This is something I've been talking about with my team a lot recently. I think 3 years from now, we will look back and realize that we confused more choice with a better experience. For years, I think, the streaming industry has operated under this assumption that consumers want unlimited options. They want more services, more content, more everything. And to be fair, consumers do. For the most part, they absolutely wanted more choice than they had in traditional cable. But I think we've reached the point where too much of a good thing can become overwhelming. Our research reveals that 40% of adults often feel overwhelmed with choice when it comes to watching TV and video content. 2 in 5 are overwhelmed. Think about that.
That's
that wasn't,
crazy.
I know that wasn't a conversation we were having 10, 15 years ago, And I don't know about you, Tim, but like I've had plenty of nights where I've spent 20 minutes scrolling through titles, watching trailers, and ultimately like ended up putting on New Girl for the 100th time. And I don't think that's unusual. I think we have access to more content than ever before, yet people are spending more time deciding what they actually want to watch than watching it. And I think SaaS channels are a great example of this. On one hand, they've made streaming more accessible and created tremendous opportunities for advertisers. But as hundreds of channels continue to launch, I think the industry needs to ask itself kind of a difficult question. At what point does adding more inventory stop creating value for consumers? We measure in our core evolution study that I mentioned, we measure 170 fast channels, and that's just fast. That's free as supported streaming TV. That's not subscription services or network apps, which we cover like over 170 more of. And new fast channels are being added to our measurement every wave 3 times a year. So I think an important thing to think about is like consumers don't wake up hoping for another 50 channels to evaluate. They wake up wanting to be entertained and
So
informed
true.
with as little friction as possible. And that's where I think this tied back to sort of the broader conversation we've been having is I think the industry has spent a lot of time optimizing content distribution and inventory expansion, but it hasn't spent enough time understanding how people actually make choices. The challenge right now is, I think, helping the right person find the right content at the right moment. So, getting back to what you were saying about like a discovery problem, that's ultimately an audience understanding problem. So, if I had to make a prediction, I think that we'll look back and kind of laugh at how, fragmentation wasn't really a measurement problem or a media planning problem. It was a consumer experience problem. We gave people so many options that finding something worth watching became work. And when that happens, people retreat to what's familiar instead of discovering something new.
There's a reason that when we go out to eat, there's a menu with a limited number of options, right? To force a choice. It's not an
Exactly.
infinite run on. Well, we could make you anything that combines these few ingredients. That's really interesting
Yeah.
about too much choice. My son's on summer vacation and he's 13. He's hanging out watching TV, and then he turned off the TV and kind of a complaint. It's like, I can't find anything to watch. And I thought to myself, that's so interesting. I think 13-year-old Tim also had the same complaint, but it's completely different now, right? Like we were limited to a certain number of channels. Now it's nearly infinite, but the same challenge remains, which
Yeah.
is I can't find anything to watch. So that'll be something interesting to come back and check on in a few years. I'm curious, Emily,
Yeah. We're just paralyzed.
totally. If you had a magic wand, this is a fun question. If you had a magic wand that you could
Okay.
wave and solve a problem for everyone, for the streaming platforms, advertisers, agencies, what would it be?
I think I'll risk being repetitive and say that I would solve for a common understanding of their ideal audience. Because when I listen to conversations with media companies across the industry, I hear incredibly smart people talking about reach and attention, outcomes, personalization, but underneath all those conversations is the same like fundamental question. It's like, who are we actually trying to reach? And surprisingly often, different organizations are answering that question differently. An automaker might define a potential customer differently than an agency or a nonprofit or a streamer, and before you've even started the campaign, you've created friction. So everyone's working hard, but they're not always working from the same understanding of the consumer. And one of the things I've learned working in consumer insights is that when everyone agrees on the audience or, how we're going to define our ideal audience, a lot of other problems become easier to solve. Planning gets easier, targeting gets easier, even creative gets better because you're developing messaging for like a clearly defined person rather than chasing KPIs. Think about how much or energy the industry spends trying to connect their platforms and IDs and data sets. And those are important challenges. But at the end of the day, consumers don't experience any of that complexity. They don't know what's going on behind the scenes. They're just people trying to watch content and get their information and be entertained. So the closer we can align our data and measurement systems around those real people, the more effective the entire ecosystem becomes. And honestly, that's what I love about the work we do at MRI-Simmons. At our core, we're helping marketers understand the consumer behind the click, behind the impression. because whether the content is delivered through linear or streaming or whatever comes next, it's still the same human being on the other side. As we've, established, technology and platforms will continue to be introduced and to change, but understanding people will always matter.
Emily, I couldn't think of a better place to end it. If folks want to learn more about MRI-Simmons, maybe check out some of the great work that you do, where should they go?
Well, they should go to MRISimmons.com. They should follow MRI-Simmons on LinkedIn. I am very involved in some of our product marketing, so I'm constantly writing blogs, I'm recording videos, and they're all put on the MRI-Simmons LinkedIn page and on the website. So check us out. If you want some free insights on a ton of different topics, please check us out and send us a message. We'd love to chat.
It's great content. You're taking a very modern approach to something that may have traditionally been thought of as kind of boring and stuffy. It's research, it's audience, but like you're putting a really cool spin on it that makes it super consumable for anyone, whether you're on day one of your media journey or you're a seasoned operator. It's a great output. We love it. Emily, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I had a good time.
If you found this conversation to be helpful, please share it with a colleague or a client. Start a conversation yourself today, and we'll see y'all next time.